All right, Harvey, you ready to get going?
I am. Good morning, Michael.
Hey, good morning. Well, let's go ahead and start this fascinating discussion and interactive dialogue about whether or not your board is cooperating with the CEO, the key success factors or potentially failure factors in co-op management. Welcome, everybody. It's so exciting. Every time I've done one of these programs, I see folks log in from all around the country. We've got people from, I can tell from the area codes Atlanta and Nevada, California, the Midwest, Minnesota, Denver area, et cetera. It's always super fun, and I see friends like Robin, Terry, Bob have logged in, so it's always super exciting, and we're very glad to bring this program to you today. If you happen to be sitting next to someone who's asking why they can't hear anything, then make sure and let them know they do need to log in to the audio portion of the program in order to hear the audio part. So make sure and ask your friends to do that. So we're presenting this to you today in a little bit of a different format. Most presentations are, at least especially by law firms, are done in, we're going to put 75 slides together and, yell at the internet for an hour. And this is a different kind of format. The intention with the interactive dialogue is to have it be just that, namely to take a topic, find an expert on that topic like Harvey, who will introduce himself in a moment, and then to ask the kinds of questions that you have about that particular topic. So for the participants, you'll see at the bottom of the screen, there's a chat pane, a Q&A, and so you're welcome to ask questions during the course of the program. I'll be monitoring those questions throughout the presentation, and then I'll either ask them or weave them into the questions that are being asked, and we'll respond to you as to which one that's going to be. So we do encourage your participation and your interaction in this dialogue on this very interesting topic. So first, self-introductions, a little bit about Dorsey for those who are unfamiliar with the firm. My name is Mike Droke. I'm a partner in the food, beverages, and agribusiness industry group. I do a lot of work with co-ops in a whole variety of different ways. And so we at Dorsey, Dorsey & Whitney is an international law firm. We have 19 offices around the world and about a little shy of 700 lawyers within the firm. We're broken out by both technical specialties, but also by industries. And one of the 6 industry focus groups is food, beverages, agribusiness, and cooperatives. And so we have in that group about 250 or so lawyers who are part of the food, beverages, agribusiness, and cooperatives industry group and who regularly speak to issues just like the one that we're going to talk about today. So when I got, really caught the co-op bug, one of the first people I met, I remember it very distinctly, Harvey, was meeting you. And you were in Seattle where I reside and came up to the office during a layover, I remember, and we first met. And Harvey, you have been just a great resource to many, many co-ops for a long time and have done such myriad things working with boards, CEOs, recruiting CEOs, and other executives for co-ops. So can you give just a brief summary of your own background and your practice?
Sure, this won't take long, 1 or 2 sentences, but thanks again for the invitation to join you and to visit with those on the phone today, too. I grew up on a dairy farm in western Washington, milked cows, and we delivered milk to Dairy Gold when I was a young child, and Dairy Gold ended up being a client of mine as I became an adult. My practice, I've been practicing since full-time 1971 in a variety of capacities, primarily with the agribusiness community and specifically with agricultural cooperatives and non-ag co-ops as well. So I've had long tenure, fortunately, in that particular niche. And primarily I work at the board CEO level on governance matters, leadership matters, and assist both parties in making wise choices, good decisions, and exercising good judgment. So that's primarily what I've been doing for nearly 50 years. Now, a lot of sub-points to that, but that's a high-level summary, Mike.
Fantastic. So, I want to start with, from my perspective at least, why co-op management is so unique. And I get asked a lot, from folks, friends who ask, what do you do for a living? And I say, well, I represent co-ops and agribusiness and the like. And they say, co-op? Like, what do you mean by co-op? And how does that work? And the primary distinguishing feature that I always say to folks that, to me, is really relevant to the conversation today is that whereas with most different companies that are not co-ops, the owners of the company have really primarily a financial stake in the entity. They want to have a profit generated making that particular kind of product. And if that profit's made, then they're happy. If the profit isn't made, then they're not happy. But it's really driven by that. And so, for example, I say if you own a couple shares of Apple Computer and you needed a watch, you would think nothing of buying a Seiko if that was what fit your needs. You wouldn't feel like you were really compelled to buy the Apple Watch. But with co-ops, of course, those on the phone know it's different in that the owners are also the people who use the service. And really that's kind of the essential definition of a co-op, that to be a member you need to participate or be a patron of the entity. And so it kind of folds the entity on itself, where the members have a real interest not just in the financial but also in the actual service. So you couldn't own the share of Apple Computer unless you had Apple products and bought them and the like. And so your interests are different, and it kind of folds itself on itself. And so that's particularly interesting from my perspective because I've seen it in the boardroom. You have this rule, and I have it here, rule number 1, the customer is always right. Rule number 2, if the customer is ever wrong, reread rule number 1. And the challenge with co-ops is that because the majority of your board is comprised of members, and by definition those members are customers who use your service, does that mean that they're always right? Does that mean that they all have to be right? And what are the implications of the co-op structure as a structure on how you manage yourself? And so, it's questions, is the board acting or thinking more like a governing body or acting or thinking more like a customer? And Harvey, I'm curious at your reaction to my comment.
Well, my experience is that, and just from the perspective that you've just outlined as far as a co-op and so forth, is that as a director, you have a natural conflict of interest. And you're conflicted because are you voting, when you're casting a vote in the boardroom, for example, are you voting with your pocketbook, or are you voting with what's in the best interest of the co-op? And as a director, you have a fiduciary duty, and oftentimes it's referred to as the duty of loyalty, which means essentially that when you go into the boardroom, you need to park your member customer hat at the door, for example, and your duty is to the co-op to protect, preserve, and safeguard the assets of the co-op. So it's important to keep in mind you need to put your personal interest aside in terms of what's in the best interest of the cooperative. And oftentimes there is somewhat of a conflict of interest there, and we'll probably talk about it more later as far as how that fits into a code of conduct.
So Harvey, if you wouldn't mind, could you move a little bit closer into the phone so that people can hear you, or speak up a little bit?
Is that better?
That's a little better. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
I'm fascinated by this topic of conflicts because, of course, as lawyers, we're often talking to our clients and boards about that. And do you have an example of a time where a board member might have a unique conflict just to them?
I just experienced that a few months ago, and here's a definitive example. A board was having a meeting, a pretty confidential meeting, an executive session, and the company was not performing at the level that they wanted to perform at, and they were talking about strategies, how to get it back on course. And one director was looking down, and he was texting on his phone. And the director sitting next to him observed the name of to whom the director was texting, and what the director was texting. He was texting some of the financial information that was being presented to the CEO of one of the co-op's major competitors. And there was a definite conflict of interest. It created quite a disruption immediately in the boardroom, and there's an example.
So it's interesting because it almost tees up the next slide. You said communicate, 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 but obviously within the context of your fiduciary duties and the importance of maintaining confidentiality. And so just in the same way that if you have a property that's for sale or the like, or you're thinking about buying a property, and if the public knew about that, then the deal price would increase. So you have an interest in maybe keeping it quiet. And the same would be true for a co-op, that they need to be really cautious about information that they have and communicating between the board and the CEO, but not necessarily out of the boardroom.
Correct. So when we talk about the next slide, communicate, a couple of things come to mind there. I think one of the things that's really important is that I like to think of the relationship between the board and the CEO as a partnership. And the foundation of that partnership is communication, which helps build trust. And consequently, it's important for the board and the CEO and vice versa to be able to have open communications with each other, to be able to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly if and when it arises. And open communication like that goes a long way towards resolving misunderstanding and conflict, which sometimes occurs in the boardroom. And I've witnessed that, and I've been involved with that as well, as far as helping to mediate those kinds of conflicts. And this is where it's really and there also on the slide you show the role of a director is not to provide management, it's to ensure that management is provided. And that's clearly the case. And this is where conflict does arise from time to time too, and you can use that process of communication to really work towards resolving that misunderstanding. And more often than not, it is a misunderstanding rather than a direct conflict.
It's interesting because I think this to me, it really illustrates the bind of co-ops to some degree because, first of all, if the way that many directors participate in the co-op is really in their role as a patron. So in particular for certain kinds of co-ops, if they're a agriculture co-op, then they're marketing their product or obtaining services, and they have a field representative that they talk to maybe 2 times a day, and then once every month or 2 they attend a board meeting, and so they hear a lot of information, they're asked a lot of questions, and they have a close relationship with people that are 1, 2, or more levels down from the CEO. And so I think, from my perspective, this distinction between providing management and ensuring that management is provided is really an important one. Can you talk to how that kind of plays out in a positive way? Have you had some great examples of boards who really understood their role was to ensure that management was provided, but not try and dive down and do it themselves?
Well, I think one of the experiences that I have, and what I really, when I'm advising a board or working with a board on a board training workshop and so forth, is that what happens sometimes, the decision-making process becomes blurred a bit between both parties. And sometimes the board begins to kind of what's known as, and I don't mean this derogatorily, but it is what managers, CEOs tell me, is to meddle in the day-to-day operations of the business. And sometimes management starts to meddle in the board's responsibility as well. So when I think about it, I like to think about it from a decision-making perspective in terms of clearly establishing an understanding of what the decision-making parameters are of both parties, for the board of directors and for management. For example, management primarily would make decisions in terms of hiring, firing employees, the organization structure, developing the business plan and budgeting process, whereas the board is primarily involved in a high level decisions as from a perspective of approving major capital expenditures, as an example, approving acquisitions, merger transactions, and most important decision a board will ever make at the end of the day is selecting the CEO when the CEO retires or when there's a change in leadership, and of course selecting the auditing firm as well. So decisions...
So, Harvey, a couple of questions. Terry Castañas, who's listening in, asked a question about, probably riffing off my comment that the majority of board members are members. But do you recommend that co-ops consider having an outside director? And if you do, why not?
Well, I think we're finding that the trend is more and more boards are bringing in outside directors. But at the co-op level, my experience is these are advisory types of directors, not voting directors, because they really, oftentimes they bring in a director that has a specific expertise, and that director might serve on an annual basis and then may continue on the annual basis or be replaced by another director, and that the director serving in that outside role understands it. That's an advisory role, a non-voting role. And there's some things that outside director needs to really keep in mind when he or she is serving in that position. So what
would be the key traits, I guess, or things that they would keep in mind?
The outside director is there to listen, observe, and not necessarily lead or guide the board, because sometimes boards will tend to look toward the outside director for recommendations and start to follow that director's lead and so forth, and being a good listener, listening with the intent to understand and not reply, and then providing input or guidance to at least ask the questions that the board should be asking and answering, and guiding the board to a decision that's appropriate for the circumstance in place can be done by the questions that are asked. And that's where I think an outside director can really make a valuable contribution, plus share personal experiences and so forth without being overbearing on the board of directors.
I love this idea. We often talk about, each of us have 2 eyes, 2 ears, and 1 mouth and should use them proportionally. And that what you're recommending is for the outside directors in particular, that proportion when they're using their mouth should be by asking questions that probe or expose, opportunities or risks, and not necessarily say, here's what I'd recommend, at least until the consensus has been driven on the board itself.
Correct. And most time, whether it's an outside director or a manager or CEO, and from a management perspective, most managers tend to lean on, unbeknownst to themselves at times too, to telling versus asking. And when I'm doing executive coaching with some of these CEOs or boards, I tend to try and guide them to ask questions, and you can guide the group or individual to the decision that probably needs to be made from an informed basis by the questions you ask. And this is a role I think an advisor or director can fill for sure.
So Greg Benefield asked an interesting question before we move on to the next slide, which kind of relates directly to the outside director, but also to the inside directors as well. And that was, do you typically recommend that boards or board members ask about indemnification provisions or other ways to kind of protect their personal assets from in their role as a board member?
Well, most boards never even bring that up because they aren't necessarily aware of it. So carrying, for example, director and officer liability insurance is one of the tools that can be used. But that's great from a protection point of view. But the best way to protect the board in terms of potential liability is to make sure that they make informed decisions. And that means they should be, asking for information that enables them to make a decision, not make quick decisions. If there's, and the best CEOs that I've worked with that really work well with the board don't ask a board to make an immediate decision. They bring a proposal, for example, whether it was an acquisition or a major capital expenditure, to the board well in advance, and then allow a month to go by and then come back and let's make the decision. In addition, boards, that are wise will utilize outside advice, their CPA, auditing firm, legal counsel, consultants, and so forth, and how certainly can rely upon that information to make informed decisions. D&O insurance, will cover them, and you could go into that from a legal perspective better than I. but it's kind of the last resort in terms of really protecting your role as a director. Being informed, and then sometimes directors fail to study the information packet that's prepared by management and distributed to them in advance, and that's really that really impairs their ability to make a good, sound judgment decision when necessary in the boardroom.
So it's interesting. I love your kind of analogy, because there's a natural flow there, because first you want to make good decisions, which requires, I often say to new board members, that their summary obligation is to use the same level of diligence, thought, attention, outside providers, information gathering, that they would exercise in making big decisions for their own farm, for their own home, and the like. And that is another way of saying the business judgment rule, but really it's do your homework, gather your information, ask a lot of questions, trust your judgment, exercise judgment, and then from a legal perspective, there are some states that allow you to exclude certain claims against board members or give you protections for indemnity, and then obviously getting insurance as the last resort in case of a claim, and then that would give the board members substantial protection, both the internal and external. So I want to move to the next topic, which is kind of policy governance, and you've mentioned this before. Even just a moment ago, you talked about structurally really understanding who makes what decision. And why do you think policy governance, well, first of all, what is policy governance? And then why do you believe that's important?
Well, policy governance, we often hear that the board sets policy and management follows policy. First of all, I believe that it has to be a collaborative effort, a collaborative process, not just one group saying the policy and the other group saluting the flag and just following the policy. So you can have lots of policies in place. You can have, and I'm not going to go into a lot of examples. I mentioned a few earlier. As far as, let's say, who hires the auditing firm, well, it's clear that would be a policy that the board would follow. But what's important here, what I'm experiencing lately, there's conflict that often arises between the board and the CEO and vice versa. And we hear more and more people talking about we need to really establish our rules of engagement. And it's like the military. What are the rules of engagement going to be? And this is where I find it's really valuable for a board to put in writing. These are decisions that are primarily in the board's wheelhouse. They make, but oftentimes I like to suggest those be made on a collaborative basis. And in the CEO's wheelhouse, these are decisions the CEO primarily makes, but also conferring with the board as well. So the rules of engagement are such that it gets where the lines get blurred is typically when they get blurred by a few minority board members or what I call a minority number of the board members begin to start to meddle in the day-to-day affairs of the business. And that's where the lines of communication get blurred. That's where decision-making gets blurred, and that's where conflict arises. And so that's when these rules of engagement, if that's what you want to refer them to, I don't, but I like to think of them as decision-making boundaries or parameters, need to be revisited. When you do that, that can help mitigate conflict. And so when you get off track, you go back to what you put in writing, and you may have to revise what you put in writing. But in my opinion, going back to the foundation will help clear up misunderstanding, and particularly when you're onboarding new board members who often come on with a particular mission in mind or charge, and once they get on board, they find out it's a quite different environment than what they see looking in from the outside before they come into the boardroom.
It's interesting. I've seen examples of this gone wrong, and I think it's very helpful. We have a picture of a boundary here. Obviously you can jump over the fence or climb through potentially. It's porous, but to some degree. But knowing, what's on one side of the fence and the other is, I think, really important. I had an example one time years ago in which a CEO decided to terminate somebody who reported to them, and the board intervened and countermanded the decision. And the result of that was, of course, that CEO really had no more authority at the company because the board had demonstrated that they were stripping it away. And that was an example of the implications were pretty significant to how the company could manage itself, and it was because a boundary had been crossed there by the board, from their role, So I think having a clear understanding on both sides and is really helpful, and to some degree, understanding. And you had some examples of particular policies that are potentially should be considered, but having an understanding of when that is and where the policies are before you're in the mix, before the question's presented, then you can have a cool head thinking about who do we want making which kinds of decisions and why, and then in the moment when you're presented with the issue, then both sides can say, okay, when we were looking at it dispassionately, this is what we said we should do, rather than being caught up in the heat of the moment. So you have some obviously board codes of conduct, committee charters, and the like, but I was really interested in working capital. Can you talk about what you mean by working capital policy?
Sure. Well, I think one of the things to keep in mind here is a good example. I worked with a grain company years ago, for years, probably 20 years, with the CEO and the board of directors. But what I really appreciated about that was that the CEO made sure that he would put together what's known as a working capital budget, a plan, and measure the results against that plan, and went over it with the board. So the board really understood that you're managing the company, so to speak, or the co-op primarily through cash flow. And consequently, he could show the inflows and the outflows and the impact on working capital, when you had to borrow or when you could repay it, and he had a particular target number that he needed to have on hand, and he guided the board through understanding that and helped the board understand that when it made decisions, what the impact of those decisions were on that working capital level. And so I felt that was really a wise direction on his part. He made that when he did his budgeting, he really focused a lot on that particular aspect. And consequently, working capital really represents the owner's equity interest in the current assets of the cooperative.
I find this, it's important, I think, for every co-op, but I find it particularly important for agriculture co-ops, because if you're, in particular, a marketing co-op, then your own revenue as a co-op is typically a percentage of the sales of the overall co-op, and potentially other charges and fees that happen. But largely it's driven by a percentage of the overall sales of your co-op members. So when prices drop, that means necessarily that the percentage drops and the total dollars drop, but the operational costs of the co-op itself may not drop. And so the challenge that I find clients face there is that when prices drop, of course, it really puts a strain on the co-op members, and there's a lot of pressure from the members, both the individual members and then personally for the board members, because they're also farmers, and also by extension to the members that they're representing on the board. There's a lot of pressure to take some of the cash and the working capital that you have and push it down to the farm level, which is totally understandable. But what it can do is it can really kind of hamstring the co-op itself, because you're losing the equity and the ability to kind of operate on behalf of all the members. And so having a working capital policy gives you a guidepost to be looking at and created while times are good, so that when times are bad, you can say, okay, this is what we had decided we were going to do. Is there a really dramatic reason why we need to shift from that? Is that a fair description, Harvey?
I think it is. There's one other point I'd like to just make here. I know everyone on the phone is aware of this, I'm sure. But one of the things that oftentimes I see missing as far as the financial management or budgeting of the co-op and discussions with the board is the creation of a capital expenditure budget in addition, let's say, to a working capital budget or a general budget. And that capital expenditure budget is really important for the board to understand, because sometimes by neglecting to reinvest in updating your facilities, your equipment, your packing line, if you're in the processing business and so forth, in the long run can really adversely impact the future of the cooperative. And I see this happening occasionally from time to time where the CEO doesn't really push that, and consequently, you end up, not reinvesting in your facilities or your equipment and so forth. And at some point in time, you kind of, end up with a bottom line that starts to really deteriorate, or you're just not operating as efficiently as you can, but you're pushing the dollars out to your membership, which everyone's happy with. But then there comes a time when you've got to really reinvest, and that might be when prices really are low. So it's something that I think a board needs to really be on top of, and not only ask to see the budget every year, but also what's that working capital budget, what's that look like? And sometimes
it's interesting, Harvey, because what you're kind of suggesting here is that while these are maybe board policies, using air quotes, at the end of the day, it's really up to the CEO to do two things. It sounds like one is to push the board to create the policy in the first place, and then second, to reaffirm that policy at least every year by kind of looking back to it, measuring them yourself against it, and by doing that, reminding the board, hey, you remember 3 years ago we had this working capital policy or fundamental capital program, and this was our plan, and this is what we're doing to the plan, so remember we had a plan and we're still executing on that plan. Does that sound fair?
It does, but the key here, too, in addition to what you've said, is that the CEO has a fiduciary duty to the cooperative to protect and safeguard its assets as well. And there are occasions when the CEO who's nearing retirement will tend not to reinvest in the facilities and the equipment, because that increases the bottom line, and consequently bonuses or incentives are higher at that level, and then he or she goes away, and the new CEO comes in and is caught up in having to make those investments, and sometimes it takes a long time, to get back on track when you have to upgrade your facilities and equipment. So this is something that the board needs to be paying attention to in terms of monitoring overall performance, and not get led down the path that we are doing so well when in reality it may not be doing as well as it appears to be.
So just to briefly, can you talk about where you find samples of policies and how you create them?
Well, there's, you could go online and you can Google samples of policies and so forth. But my belief is that there's lots of examples of policies. We've written the Agricultural Co-op Director Guidebook series, which we'll mention later, and we've given a process there to address that. But I like to say that, for example, that co-ops have some committees. If they've got a large enough board, like a board governance committee, which primarily would be focusing on things like the board code of conduct as a policy area. If you have committees, you should have charters, which like a job description for the committee, as well. When we talk about safety up here, I really see that in the board needs to make sure that sound safety practices are being put in place. But I believe that that's really the management's responsibility. It should be able to demonstrate to the board that sound safety practices and procedures are in place, and not just rely upon complying, for example, with OSHA requirements, but going beyond that, and maybe having someone come in and look at your safety practices and make recommendations there. Particularly, it doesn't matter whether you're in the grain industry or food processing sector. Oftentimes the state regulations or federal regulations are minimal, and I've had experiences with other companies, co-ops, where they've had an accident and so forth, and while they've been in compliance with the OSHA requirements, they still have had an accident occur, and they've had to upgrade their safety practices. So that's an area that really is getting a lot of attention by many of my clients today.
So moving on, because and actually safety in a way is a good example of something that the board would be setting as a policy, but really it's to the CEO to determine what the best way to execute that policy is and then execute on it, right? And so, you'd want to stick to your policies as we talk about board member habits. There's two other kind of bullet points here. One, confidentiality is key, And second, respecting the CEO's management in discussions with staff. And then, subpart, even when you disagree. And so I want to focus on that last one, how do you advise board members when there's a discussion at the board level with the CEO, and they just think that the way the CEO is going is not the right way to go? What do you recommend that they do when they leave the boardroom?
That stays in the boardroom. It doesn't go out of the boardroom. What they do need to do is, have a conversation with the CEO about those differences of opinion or disagreements and resolve those within the boardroom. It would be very disruptive if board members take that outside the boardroom and talk about it in the coffee shop where others can hear, or talk about it with employees and so forth. That's a matter that needs to be dealt with within executive session, maybe without the CEO if board members have a particular concern, and then it needs to be addressed by the chair particularly and the vice chair. I always recommend if there's an issue or any communication of a sensitive nature with the CEO, it should not be one-on-one between the chair and the CEO. It should at least be the chair or at least two board members for confirmation of what was said by whom and how it was communicated. The point when you ask the question, too, it leads me to think about the fact that there are times when naturally in a cooperative where the members, the boards, for example, board members are in direct contact with employees. And sometimes employees will try to leverage a relationship that they developed with that director and start complaining about a certain issue in the company and so forth. And my advice to the director is just to listen with the intent to understand and not reply. Don't give a response, just listen, and then as soon as they receive that information, I would communicate it directly to the CEO if it's appropriate, if it's a matter that's not a complaint about the CEO but just something else that's going on, or to the board chair, and direct their complaint to say, you should really be talking to your supervisor about this matter. It's not something I can address. But the fact that you as a director became aware of it means that you should inform the CEOs, so particularly so that there's no surprises at the CEO's level. Probing, about management practices or leadership of the CEO by a board member with employees is totally inappropriate from my perspective. If you're really concerned about that, that should be an issue discussed at the board level, and then the board determines how to proceed in that.
I was thinking about this, Harvey. You'd mentioned in preparation for today that the softball question: how many employees does the board have? And the answer, of course, is one. They only supervise one person at the company, and that's the CEO, right?
Correct.
So I had an example of this very challenge. This was for a food cooperative, meaning a natural grocery co-op. Lots of members, and the board member, who was of course also a member of the co-op itself, and just loved the coffee, because I'll say, having tasted it, was phenomenal coffee. So anyway, every morning at about 7 o'clock, she would come into the co-op and get coffee and a breakfast. And so she, of course, developed a really good relationship with the clerk who worked in the coffee shop as part of the food co-op. And so the company, the co-op was in labor negotiations, and during the board in closed session, the board was apprised of what's happening in labor negotiations and the like. And so the clerk started asking questions about what's happening and why is this happening in bargaining, and why is the co-op taking this position, and why aren't we getting a better health care rate or higher pay or the like. And so it really put the board member in a bind, and the importance there was to not say anything. Respond by saying, thank you for the information, this is really helpful feedback, we really appreciate you personally and your work here, but not say, I agree, and I told the CEO they needed to do something different, whatever. So I think from my perspective in advising boards, I often will walk through the board itself with specific examples of the kinds of things where they're going to get pressured when they go either to the food co-op, or they go back to their farm and they get a call from their cousin who's also a member, and probe for information and actually kind of model what do you say, because it's obviously a little bit awkward at the time. So when you talk about director oversight and the best practices, I guess that I'm really kind of going to your first recommendation here, which is challenge management, but only in the boardroom.
Correct, but I think going back to the point you made, I just want to follow up on that. Is that when the board leaves the boardroom, there should be a unified position that the board has agreed to, and you're going to have people on different board members on different sides of the issue at times. But at the end of the day, it should go out with, even though a board member may have voted against a particular resolution or a motion, you should go out with a unified voice. And you don't want to go out, and board members should not be going out to the membership say, well, we voted that way, but I didn't really agree with the entire board. And then you apply that you weren't a supporter of that, of the board's decision. That really undermines the effectiveness of the board as a leader for the overall organization. So that's one of the cautionary notes I would say there. When we talk
I was thinking that really goes to the chairperson's role. I think sometimes the chairperson on a board, is elected typically by the other board members to that position. It's incredibly flattering, of course, but they don't always necessarily recognize the importance of their job in managing the relationship between the board members, managing the board meetings. So, for example, what you're really saying here, Harvey, is that at the beginning of the sitting of the board, which typically happens annually, you get a couple new board members in, it's important to just reaffirm that importance of making a decision, and then whether you agreed with it or not, everybody says that was the decision of the board, period. Not that was the decision of the board and I agreed, or that was the decision of the board and I disagreed. Rather, that was the decision, it was reached, that's what I'm going to say, right?
Correct, and the best way that I've found lately, and I've been in the last 3 or 4 years, that I've found really helpful to the board, at the end of every meeting, and now I have some of my clients adopting this practice, before you leave the meeting and you reach adjournment, 2 things happen. One, if there's major issues that were discussed, the board talks and the chair leads the discussion. What is our storyline, I call it, when we go out of this meeting today, about what are we comfortable in disclosing to the membership or publicly, and what are we not comfortably disclosing? And you have that conversation so it's clear before you leave the meeting. You just don't assume everyone understands what's going to be said. In addition to that, what I find missing in many cases is that during the course of the discussion, there are certain action items that management has been assigned and certain action items that the board has been assigned. And then those just get forgotten and never brought up again. So I also suggest at the end of the meeting that the secretary keeps track of these things. Whoever's taking minutes says, okay, these are board action items and these are the CEO or management's action items. And then that becomes an agenda item for a report out at the next board meeting. And that way, work that gets measured, and my theory is work that gets measured is work that gets done. And I'm finding that that's really been helpful to co-ops in moving things ahead and forward in a disciplined, focused manner.
I love it. So, Michael, who's listening in, asked a really interesting question that actually came up in a conversation with me yesterday with a different client, really talking to the CEO and CFO about an upcoming board meeting. And Michael's question was, it relates to management of the board and the meetings. How do you get directors to talk in the board meeting itself? How do you deal with somebody who's sitting in the meeting mute and not conveying their perspective?
It's really simple, and I when I facilitate, let's say it's a merger transaction, and we're getting down to making some final decisions, you have a couple of board members that have been silent the entire time. What I do is, and it works every time, I've never had a failure on this, and that is I tell everyone in advance, if you're not speaking, we're going to call on you. And we know you've got something good to say or something valuable to contribute here. And I just go around the room and look each director in the eye and say, what's your opinion? And sometimes you have to wait a second or so for them to respond. But it's surprising how some of the information that comes forth really can change the entire course of the discussion. But what I do is I caution other board members not to immediately shut down that idea that's being put forth out on the table, because if you do, it just stymies the discussion. Every director has been elected to represent the interests of their constituency, and their input and ideas are valuable, and I try to convey that to the board, and it works. In fact, last week I was working with the board, and we had a couple of members that were not talking, and this was a board training workshop, and then I said, well, we're going to go around the room. I need to know what your perspective is on this, and you'd surprise how quickly they would respond. So as the chair, your role, you've got to drag, I call it, you've got to drag those directors' viewpoints into the conversation and make sure that every voice is heard.
You know, it's interesting. We'll get in a moment. I know you have a director booklet on Robert's Rules of Order, and typically what is supposed to happen is you have a motion, it's seconded, then there's discussion, not a vote, but discussion, and that's a real opportunity to go around. I call it going around the horn. If each person say, what's your discussion point, what's your discussion point, so that each board member not only has an opportunity to have their say, but actually does, in fact, have their say. Right. And only then does the vote happen, once everyone has had the opportunity to present their viewpoint. And I think it's pretty common within any group that you tend to get a couple of voices that just like hearing themselves. And so you have to figure a way to manage through that and ensure that the folks that aren't as comfortable have an opportunity. So now you say here the board to CEO, chairperson role, board to CEO, relationship development and board communications. What do you mean by that?
Okay. So what I mean by that, as far as relationship development and the board, is that it's really what I mean by that is that I think it's important for the chair working with the CEO to review the agenda in advance together, develop it together, and not do it last minute, but get together at least some period of time before the next board meeting, whatever that is. I think it's important for the chair to be able to be frank and open with the CEO, because the CEO, it's a lonely position to be in. And there's things he can't or she can't discuss with his leadership team or management team, and he needs an outlet. He needs someone sometimes that he can vent with. And that's where the chair can be an ally in that regard. So alignment between the chair and the CEO and vice versa is really important. One of the dangers, though, that we see happening over time is sometimes it can be a very contentious relationship, particularly when the chair is a, quote, wannabe CEO, for example. And oftentimes when I've talked to CEOs who I work with closely as well, many will say, I've got really a great chair, but I'm not looking forward to next year's chair because it's going to be really challenging there. So it's important for the CEO to be able to navigate through all those changing relationships.
It's fascinating. We're going to move on to the CEO's perspective as well. One quick note here. This is partly just me as the lawyer. Keep this a secret. I do find that, in particular, we all have challenges with this, I suppose, but with co-op boards in particular, understanding what is confidential, what does it mean to be confidential, how are you sometimes accidentally disclosing confidential information. Right. It requires a real discussion, and rather than just about the fact of it keeping things confidential, I think you need to get way more granular than that and to really talk about specifics of, okay, during this meeting, these are the things that were confidential, and if you're asked about them, or these are the ways, you're not to say anything, or respond instead this way, et cetera. So being very, very practical. Why CEOs succeed you talk about mastering execution is the best way to have a CEO keep his or her job. Why do you say that?
I say that because many CEOs have a great strategic vision for the company, but they fail to execute. And there's lots of examples, whether it's among co-ops or even among the non-co-op sector. So for the follow-through, the follow-up, and you can paint a great picture of where you want to lead the company, but if you aren't really executing and putting in place action plans and working with the leadership team in a manner that they are going to follow through on execution in their areas of responsibility, then you're not going to accomplish your goals, and it's just a lot of talk but no action, so to speak. And when I say that, that's probably, and there's research out there that demonstrates that if you fail to execute, and that's true not only at the CEO level, but it's also true at the board level.
You know, one of my favorite book titles is called Five Frogs on a Log, and Five Frogs on a Log is a parable that 5 frogs are sitting on a log, and 4 of the 5 decide they're going to jump into the pond. And so the question is, how many frogs are still on the log? And the answer, of course, is 5, because deciding to jump and the act of jumping are fundamentally different activities. So now, why CEOs fail? I'm interested in particular for the question about denying problems when they exist. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean by that is that some CEOs just won't admit that there's an issue that's on the table and has to be addressed, and they just ignore it, and their leadership team sees it as being ignored as well, but they're not going to necessarily challenge the CEO, and sometimes boards are aware there's an issue, but they don't see it being addressed. So that's a reason sometimes, but there's a couple of other reasons too. I'd like to just share that aren't on the slide here. And we talked about the execution, but the second, and these are proven reasons that CEOs fail. Oftentimes, probably one of the biggest reasons leads to the fact that the CEO is relying upon a really strong leadership team, but when he has a weak member there, he fails to fix that particular issue in time. In other words, by repositioning that individual or actually releasing that individual, and more often he fails to release them because he was the one that selected them that person to begin with, and it reflects adversely, let's say, on his judgment. But those,
you know, it's interesting because what happens, I see, is that the board members, because they're users of the service, they know the problems there. And so the CEO doesn't gain anything by failing to address it, because it's kind of the elephant in the living room, and that she or he should address it and say, okay, this is the issue, this is how I plan to address it, or this is the issue, I'd love your guidance as to how to address it. But by denying it is really doesn't help anybody. So now moving on to the next topic, why boards succeed as a board, mastering group dynamics and focusing on substantive issues. So what do you mean by substantive issues?
Well, I think sometimes the board gets involved in issues that aren't always germane to the success of the cooperative or the company, for example. And they can get distracted by political issues. They can get distracted by just a number of things that aren't really germane to the strategic direction for the company. So what I'd like to suggest at the beginning of every board meeting is that the board chair, and usually there's maybe 3 to 5 key strategic initiatives for the co-op, that the board chair says, I just want to remind everyone, today the decisions we're going to be making and so forth need to be in alignment with our key strategic initiatives, perhaps that were established at the most recent strategic planning session, so that the board doesn't lose sight what their purpose is during that meeting and doesn't get down to, you hear this example, it's old school, for example, worrying about the paint of the truck, the delivery truck, for example, is an example often that's used, but it focuses on the high-level matters that are going to really contribute to the overall long-term success of the co-op on behalf of
And this is a great area where the CEO can help guide the chairperson to success, because they can help draft the agenda, put the bullet points of the key objectives and the like, and really help keep everything on track. The next topic, I'm kind of mindful of time here, Harvey, but the next topic is why boards fail, and you have a couple of things here. I thought I was particularly interested in the tendency of directors to be passive versus proactive, and what you meant by that.
Well, I'll give you an example. I'm working with a client right now on a particular issue that speaks directly to that. They had family heritage leading the cooperative from a CEO that was there for the family, was guiding the company for 50 years, maybe 40 years at the father's level, and then his son was automatically moved into the CEO position. The board became pretty passive and never questioned or challenged that individual until things really went south, and the customers of the cooperative then, because of what was going on and the lack of producing the quality product that the customers wanted, and this was a consumer product goods co-op, actually 20% said, we're not going to buy your product anymore. And that really woke the growers' eyes up, because their livelihood is dependent upon the sale of their products that they delivered to the co-op. And so that's an example of a co-op board becoming too passive and so forth. And as a result, several board members withdrew from the co-op, and they got a younger group of board members involved now as well. So, and they did not have term limits either. And
I'm one of the participants asked a question I thought was interesting, kind of related to passive versus proactive, and that had to do with information. And the specific question was, is it appropriate to limit a board member's access to co-op financial information? And just from a legal perspective, I'll say that the co-op board members' rights vary by jurisdiction. And so, for example, in California, there's actually a statutory right of a co-op board member to have access to financial or other information of the co-op. But how have you handled situations, Harvey, where you have a member who is clearly not using the information that they have access to as a board member in the right way?
Well, you go back. So board members should have access to information, complete access to the information, in my opinion. But if they are misusing that information, distributing it or commenting on it or so forth outside the boardroom in an inappropriate manner, then you have what's known as, you could go back to your code of conduct. And your code of conduct should really have address issues like that. Maybe you call it breach of confidentiality or whatever it is in there. And today I see more and more of my clients not only saying you shouldn't do it, but there is a financial penalty that can be applied to that of a substantial dollar amount, so that if there really is a breach of confidentiality, then you're going to be fined a certain amount of money, and then you're going to be restricted from certain other activities at the board level as well. Most times your board can't just remove a director, because it often depends on the state law or regulations, and most of the states here in the Northwest, will say that the director can only be removed by a vote of the members. So there are penalties that can be put in place, and I actually was involved with that a year ago with a company where there was a member there that was loose lips, okay, and that loose lips was creating some real issues for the co-op.
Which kind of gets to the next question I had. This on the slide number 17, the board is partner, and you say don't test, cross-examine, or assert superior authority, ask loaded questions. What do you mean by that?
Well, there are times when a certain director wants to, what I call, get all puffed up and show us stuff and demonstrate his competency to the board. So he or she will ask what we call a loaded question, which is a question everyone already knows the answer to, but he's just testing the CEO's integrity, for example, or the CEO's willingness to share information with the board, and it really creates, it creates conflict. It creates, lack of trust between that CEO, maybe that board member, or the entire board as well. And we see that happening occasionally, where that's what I call a loaded question.
Got it. Then, we have the CEO as partner, and there's some things that are pretty straightforward, respecting the board's right and role, staying in touch, providing information. And then the second to last bullet point I thought was interesting, responding promptly and completely to all requests for information, which kind of goes to our discussion before, and then providing reasonable contact with senior managers through board reports and the like, which I've seen boards do it both ways, where they have senior managers in the board meeting the entire time, also when senior managers come in and have time with the CEO present or time with the CEO not present. And do you have a recommendation as far as what's a best practice there?
On the last bullet, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, on the last bullet.
Yeah, I really recommend, and I see that relationships with the board and confidence in the CEO is best when he is comfortable or she is comfortable having the entire senior management team present during the board meetings, whether they're making a presentation or not. It shows that the CEO and the leadership team, have a collegial working relationship with each other. It's important for the senior management team to understand what the board's perspectives are as well. And then, absent that, there's always then there should be an executive session, if appropriate, between the CEO and the board separately. But I've seen it where the CEO is the only one in the room and never brings in any senior management team members, and that's when you start to see some problems that arise, or it's an indication that the CEO may be withholding information from the board. And the CEOs that have the longest tenure that I've worked over my career are those that are just totally open and give board access to the senior management team from an information, perspective, and everyone understands what those ground rules are, and it works really well that way.
And I'm going to quote somebody, one of the comments that one of our listeners had here, in particular as to the senior management. If the CEO is not confident in them, then they really need to, as Michael says here, hire slow but fire fast. If the CEO does not have that level of confidence, then they need to move the person along. So with that, just a comment about some resources that are out there as we wrap it up. I do recommend folks look at, Harvey, your book, series of books actually on guidebook series on co-op management. You've got 3 guidebooks, one on Robert's Rules of Order Made Easy, written with the co-op board and directors in mind. Also a summary of board governance best practices, and then guidebook on monitoring financial performance, particularly in the context of the co-op management. There also are some great, for listeners, there's some other great materials that are out there. University of Wisconsin has Center of Cooperatives, and I put the link to their website here. The USDA has a cooperative development program, which is really geared towards rural agriculture, but the concepts and content are exceptional and also really relevant to any kind of co-op as well. For those who are lawyers and you'd like to get CLE, continuing legal education credit, you're welcome to do that. You got a sign-in sheet with the reminder email yesterday. Just return that to Michelle Hubble. There's a link there, and then she'll send your CLE certification form. We also have a feedback request, and we really, really love your feedback. Really want to hear from you about what topics you'd like, whether you like the program. I've already had a couple of people in the chat pane say great session. We love hearing that, but also if there are ways that we can improve, we're delighted to get that information as well. And so with that, Harvey, just as someone that I deeply respect and appreciate, I wanted to thank you for this great presentation, for your great content, but also for your great service to cooperatives around the United States and your service to the community. So thank you, Harvey.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation, Mike, and good luck to everyone as you move forward in your practices as well.
All right, terrific. Well, thank you, and this will end our presentation. Have a wonderful day, everybody.